Hey guys, how you going? In this video I'm going to be showing you how to create a custom checkbox from scratch using plain HTML and CSS, which means there is no need for any JavaScript in order for this checkbox to work. It's going to be compatible with most, if not all, of the modern web browsers, including Internet Explorer. It does not require any sort of external libraries or dependencies in order to work, not even for the actual checkmark icon right there. So it's going to be easy to create and definitely easy to use and implement in existing web projects or websites. So this right here is the final result. We can see just down here we have the custom checkbox. It looks pretty nice, and if I was to click on it, obviously I'm toggling the state of the checkbox and it's working perfectly fine. We've even got a little animation or transition on the background color and also the checkmark symbol or icon itself. So it's going to be very easy to create, and we're going to be doing it from scratch inside this HTML file right here. So let's go inside the text editor and we can begin inside here by firstly just creating a new directory to hold all of the CSS for the checkbox. So I can call this directory CSS, and then inside here make a new file called checkbox.css. So this file right here is going to contain all of the styles for the custom checkbox. Back inside the HTML, we can now of course just include that CSS inside the HTML. Of course we can say CSS and then checkbox.css right there. So now we have successfully included the CSS inside the HTML page. We can begin work firstly on the actual HTML for the custom checkbox. So essentially we're going to be writing out the HTML and then we're going to work on the CSS, which is of course going to be the bulk of this video. The way this custom checkbox is going to work is essentially we're going to be creating a wrapper or a container around an actual input type checkbox. Okay, so we're going to be creating this container or this wrapper with a label element. So we can make a new label right here and we can set the for attribute to something like my checkbox ID. And this for attribute is very important to how this checkbox works, but I'll go into more detail about that in a few moments. But for now, we are also going to be adding a class to the label to be simply just checkbox. So of course, this class allows us to then style it inside the CSS. So now inside the actual container, we can make an actual input element. So we can say input right here with a type of checkbox. So first up, you want to make sure that the ID of your input element is the same as what you put inside the for the label. So I'm going to copy this ID and paste it inside here. So now, for those of you who don't know, essentially when you press on label elements, then they are going to toggle the state of the checkbox with the same ID as what's inside the for attribute. So that's why these two values right here need to match up in order for this to work correctly. Also give your checkbox a name. So for example, my checkbox name, and this ensures that the actual value is going to be submitted to the server when the form gets submitted. We also need to add a class of checkbox__input, and for those of you who watch my videos frequently, you would know that I like to use the block element modifier or the BEM CSS naming convention, which is why I've chosen to use __ then input, but you can of course name your classes whatever you like. So just one more thing to keep in mind is that we are going to be hiding this input element using CSS. So don't worry if you're concerned that this thing is going to be showing inside your custom checkbox. We can now write out the HTML for the actual checkbox box with the check mark. So this is going to be represented, so I'm referring to this box right here. This will be represented by a div. Okay, so let's go back inside here and make a new div directly after the input and give this div a class of checkbox__box. And we're going to be keeping this empty, and instead we're going to be using CSS to actually insert the checkmark symbol. So now for the actual label, so for the real label, this is just going to be some plain text. So we can say, for example, yes, send me emails. Okay, so now we have the HTML structure for the label complete. I can save this and then refresh the browser, and we can see right here we get, of course, the original input element, and then of course the label right there. So now we can move on to the CSS, which of course is going to be the main chunk of this tutorial. So back inside here, let's hop inside the Checkbox CSS, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to be setting the display of the checkbox label to be flexbox. So we're going to say right here, we're going to target the checkbox class, and we're going to say display and make this inline flex. The reason for this flex box is because we want a 2-column layer. We want the checkbox box to be on the left side and the actual label text to be on the right side. And of course, flexbox allows us to achieve that really easily. It's also going to be an inline flex because we don't want the label to be taking up the entire width of the web page. We can then say align items and make this to the center, and this is going to vertically center the text in line with the actual checkbox box. Also, a cursor of pointer will of course enable a custom cursor when you hover over the actual checkbox. So I'm going to save this here and refresh, and we can see we get this result right here. So not looking too bad so far, and if I was to hover over the text, we can see we get that custom pointer cursor. Okay, so anyway, let's go back inside here, and actually I might just demonstrate real quickly. As we can see, if I was to click on the label, then the checkbox gets pressed. So essentially we're going to be hiding this one now, and instead doing that state behavior on the actual checkbox box div which we created. So anyway, back inside here, let's go ahead and actually hide the original checkbox input. So we can say here checkbox underscore underscore input and simply say display as being none. Save this and refresh, and now of course we get nothing right there. So now we can move on to the main chunk of the CSS, and that is going to be the actual checkbox box. So let's go inside here and target the class of checkbox box. Okay, for this we're going to be setting the width and the height to the exact same value, and this will of course give us a nice square. So I can say width and make this 1.25 em, and the height of the same value 1.25 em. Now the reason why I've chosen to use an em unit here is because when I change the font size of my checkbox, then I want the actual checkbox box to scale accordingly. So essentially this em is a relative unit, and it means basically 1.25 multiplied by the current font size. So for example, if the current font size was 16 pixels, this would be 1.25 times 16, and then of course be 20 pixels. Okay, so definitely try and use a relative unit here such as em for your width and height of the checkbox. We can also add a border of 2px and then solid and then CCC for light grey. I'm now going to save this and refresh the browser once again, and we can see here it is looking pretty good so far. So we have the checkbox, and now we can just add a few more final touches to the actual box. So back inside here, we can add a border radius. So we can say border radius and make this 3 pixels for a bit of rounded edges. We can also display this as a flex, give it an align items of center, and a justify content of center. These 3 properties are going to essentially allow us to vertically and horizontally align the check mark symbol, which we're going to be adding a bit later on. We can also say margin right and make this 10 pixels just to add some space between the checkbox and the label. Also, very important, you want to make sure that flex shrink is set to 0. This is because when you resize and there's a bit of text there, then the actual box is going to shrink in size and not be a perfect square if you don't have flex shrink set to 0. I'm now going to save this and refresh, and we can see right here we get the exact same result as what it looks like on this page. So once again, progressing pretty well. So now we can move on to actually adding the check mark. So we're going to be using a CSS pseudo element to create this check mark. So essentially, we're going to go down here and we're going to say checkbox underscore underscore box once again, and then say double colon after. For those of you who don't know what this is, essentially by doing colon colon after, you are creating a virtual element in CSS that becomes part of the checkbox box element. So basically, by doing this, you are doing something like this. It's like you are putting an after inside the div right there. So that is our virtual element, and inside there, we are going to, of course, put the content and set the content to be an actual checkmark symbol. So to achieve this, we're going to say content and make this \2714. And that is the Unicode representation of the checkmark. So now the browser is going to read this and it's going to give us a symbol that is a checkmark. So I'm going to save this and refresh, and we can see right here we get the checkmark symbol looking pretty good. And of course, by using this method, we don't need an external library or an external icon library to achieve this checkmark. So if I was to now inspect this element, we can see here we have the after pseudo element inside the checkbox, happily containing the checkmark symbol. So now we can go back inside here, and we can essentially just change the color of this symbol to be white, because as we know, we're going to be having a blue background. So we might as well make it white right now, or the actual text color white. So back inside here, let's just set this to be color and white. So we can now move on to doing the logic where essentially if the input was checked, so as we know, the way these inputs work is if I was to add the checked attribute right here, then of course the input is going to be checked. So what we can do is we can basically, in CSS, we can detect whether or not this thing is checked. And if it is, then we can apply styles to some elements. So in order to do this, we can go back inside here and we can target the the checkbox underscore underscore input class. So we're going to be targeting the actual input itself. Okay, then we're going to say colon and then checked. This right here is a CSS pseudo class, and it basically means it is going to select the input when it is checked. But we are now going to say plus and then checkbox underscore underscore box. Okay, so now this is saying when the checkbox input is checked, okay, it is going to select the checkbox box element. So this plus is the adjacent sibling combinator, and basically it is going to select the next sibling with this class. So as we know, back inside here, this is the parent, okay, and this class right here, this element with this class is the next sibling after this input. So this plus is going to select that particular class only when it is checked. Okay, so pretty cool stuff. So now I'm going to say background and make this 2266 DC, and that is the same blue which I used earlier. I can then say border color and make this the same color, so 2266 and DC. I can now save this and refresh, and we can see if I was to now click on the checkbox, it turns blue. So this right here is the main part as the reason why this is a pure CSS checkbox, because we don't need JavaScript in order to perform this logic. It's all nicely working using just CSS and that selected pseudo class. So I also want to point out that because we're going to be using this method right here, it means that if I was to add the checked attribute to the input on page load and then save this and refresh, we can see it is checked by default. So this is why it is easy to use and easy to implement on existing websites or projects. So we can now add the final touches, and that is going to be the transitions and the animations for the background color and also the check mark scaling. So let's go back inside the CSS. We're going to be adding essentially a transition property to the checkbox box. Okay, this will be background at 0. Oh, if I can spell. So at 0.15 seconds and border color at 0.15 seconds. So essentially here is just saying that when the background changes, it's going to take 0.15 seconds to change, and that will of course create a nice transition or a nice effect. So essentially down here is where the background and the border color changes, so that is when this transition is going to be applied. We can also, you know what, let's just save this and refresh, see what it actually looks like, and we can see it works perfectly fine right there. Okay, so we can also go back inside here and apply the logic or this transition for the actual check mark symbol itself. So for this, we're going to be hopping onto the after pseudo element, and we're going to say transform, and we're going to be setting the scale to be 0 by default. So of course here this just means that by default the checkbox symbol is going to be a 0% scale, basically non-existent. Okay, and then we can then apply a second check pseudo class rule to the bottom here, or selector. So we can basically say checkbox input and then check. Then we can instead target the after pseudo element right here. So very similar to the above example, however this time we're targeting the after pseudo element instead of the actual checkbox box itself. Okay, so inside here we can say transform scale and make this 1. Okay, then we can also of course just go inside here and say transition, very similar to the above, and say transform is going to take 0.15 seconds. Alrighty, I can now save this and refresh once again, and we can see it is now working perfectly fine. We've got the transition on the background color and also the check mark symbol itself. And that is how to create a custom checkbox from scratch using plain HTML and CSS. Thank you for watching, guys, and I'll see you later.